In the spring of 1932, three guards made a mistake that would cost them their careers, their reputations, and very nearly their lives. They didn't rob a bank. They didn't break the law. They did something far more dangerous in the confined world of Sing Sing Correctional Facility. They publicly humiliated Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, a man whose name carried weight on both sides of the law from Harlem to the Hudson Valley. The incident occurred on a Tuesday morning, April 12th, during breakfast service in the main dining hall. 640 men sat in rows, eating in near silence under the watchful eyes of 17 guards. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and institutional oatmeal. Guard Thomas McKinley, a stocky Irish-American with 8 years on the job, stood near table 47, where Johnson sat with 4 other inmates from the segregated wing. What happened next would become the subject of whispered conversations in precinct houses and prison mess halls for decades to come. McKinley approached the table and, according to multiple witness statements collected later by the New York Department of Corrections, called Johnson a racial slur loud enough for half the dining hall to hear. 2 other guards, Patrick Sullivan and Vincent Moretti, laughed. Sullivan reportedly added his own insult, questioning Johnson's intelligence and suggesting he belonged in the fields, not among civilized men. Johnson didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look up from his breakfast tray. He simply continued eating his oatmeal, spoon moving from bowl to mouth with mechanical precision. But everyone who was watching, and by now, nearly every inmate in that hall was watching, saw something change in the air. One inmate, later identified in prison records as Marcus Webb, inmate number 23847, would tell investigators that the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Another said it was like watching a cobra decide whether to strike. Johnson finished his meal. He stood up. He walked his tray to the collection window, and then he returned to his cell block without saying a single word. That silence, as it turned out, was the most terrifying response he could have given, because 48 hours later, Warden Lewis Laws, one of the most powerful men in the New York penal system, a reformer who'd written books about prison administration and advised governors, submitted his resignation. And in the 2 days between that insult and that resignation, something happened inside Sing Sing that prison officials tried desperately to keep out of the newspapers. What power could a convicted felon possibly wield from inside a maximum security prison? How could an inmate, locked in a cell, stripped of freedom and rights, force the entire command structure of one of America's most notorious prisons to collapse in less than 48 hours? The answer lies not in violence, but in something far more complex. The invisible architecture of power that existed in America's prisons during the Great Depression, and the unique position Bumpy Johnson held in a world where the law and the underworld weren't as separate as the public wanted to believe. To understand what happened in those 48 hours, you first need to understand who Bumpy Johnson was in 1932 and why 3 guards making the worst decision of their careers wasn't just a mistake. It was a declaration of war against a network that stretched far beyond the walls of Sing Sing. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina, on October 31st, 1905. He moved to Harlem as a teenager in 1919, arriving in New York during what historians call the Great Migration, when approximately 1.6 million African Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities between 1916 and 1930, seeking economic opportunity and escape from Jim Crow laws. The nickname Bumpy came from a childhood illness that left calcium deposits on his skull, visible lumps that other children mocked, but that Johnson would later wear as a badge of identity. By his early 20s, he'd become known for something else, an almost supernatural ability to navigate the complex power structures of Harlem's criminal underworld. But Johnson wasn't your typical street thug. He read voraciously philosophy, history, military strategy. He quoted Marcus Garvey and studied the tactics of ancient generals. Multiple accounts from the period describe him as soft-spoken, impeccably dressed when not in prison grays, and possessed of what one Harlem journalist called the kind of intelligence that makes powerful men nervous. By 1930, Johnson was already connected to Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary queenie of Harlem's numbers racket, a woman who ran a gambling empire worth millions of dollars annually and who commanded more respect in Black Harlem than most politicians. St. Clair employed Johnson as an enforcer, but more importantly, as a strategist. His job wasn't to break bones, though he could. His job was to think 3 moves ahead, to understand leverage, to know which conversations to have and which threats to leave unspoken. This was the man sitting in Sing Sing on that April morning in 1932. He was there on a conviction for armed robbery, a sentence that most street-level operators knew was partially a setup, a way for the NYPD to remove a rising power player from Harlem while Dutch Schultz, a white mob boss, made moves on the numbers racket. But being in prison didn't make Johnson powerless. In fact, in the bizarre economy of Depression-era corrections, it might have made him more dangerous. Sing Sing in 1932 was a city within a city. Built in 1826 on the banks of the Hudson River in Ossining, New York, it housed over 1,700 inmates in a facility designed for 1,200. The prison operated multiple workshops where inmates manufactured everything from furniture to license plates. More importantly, it operated on 2 economies, the official one that the warden controlled, and the invisible one that ran through the cell blocks like an underground river. The official economy was simple. Follow the rules. Do your work, serve your time. The invisible economy was far more complex. Every prison has its black market, cigarettes, food, information protection. But Sing Sing in the early 1930s had something else, a direct line to the outside world that most people couldn't imagine. Guards were underpaid. The Depression had cut state budgets. A correctional officer might make $1,800 a year while watching men who had connections to operations making thousands of dollars a week. Some guards could be bought. Some could be intimidated. Some could be compromised. And some, like Thomas McKinley, Patrick Sullivan, and Vincent Moretti, were just racist enough and stupid enough to think that a man behind bars had no power at all. According to a confidential report later filed by New York State investigator Harold Danforth, a document that surfaced in the 1970s when prison reform activists requested historical records under the Freedom of Information Act, at least 11 guards at Sing Sing were on the payroll of various criminal organizations as of April 1932. They smuggled in letters, carried out messages, delivered contraband, and most importantly, provided information about prison operations. Johnson had cultivated relationships with at least 3 of these guards. Not through direct payment, his assets were frozen, but through connections on the outside. Stephanie St. Clair made sure that certain guards' gambling debts disappeared. The Genovese family, which had its own inmates in Sing Sing and complex relationships with Harlem operators, applied subtle pressure through union connections. When McKinley insulted Johnson that Tuesday morning, he didn't just insult a man. He insulted a node in a network, and that network began to activate. Tuesday afternoon, 2 p.m., Johnson was assigned to the prison workshop, manufacturing furniture legs on a lathe. He worked in silence, as he always did, operating the machinery with the same methodical precision he'd shown at breakfast. But other inmates were talking. By 3 p.m., every black inmate in Sing Sing knew what had happened in the dining hall. By 4 p.m., so did most of the white inmates with connections to organized crime. The conversation spread through the secret channels that every prison develops. Whispered conversations during work detail, coded messages left in library books, information passed through the few inmates who worked as runners between cell blocks. Marcus Webb, the inmate who later testified to investigators, said that by dinner time on Tuesday, you could feel the tension like a storm coming in off the river. Guards noticed it too. Several incident reports from that evening mention unusual quiet and subdued atmosphere among the inmate population. What the guards didn't know was that messages were already moving outside the prison walls. A letter went out that evening with the regular mail, officially to Johnson's cousin in Harlem, actually to a front address where Stephanie Street Claire's organization collected messages. The letter contained nothing illegal, nothing that would trigger the prison censor. It was a simple update about Johnson's health and a casual mention of disrespectful treatment by facility staff. That was all it took. By Wednesday morning, 3 things had happened. First, a lawyer named Samuel Leibovitz, one of the most famous defense attorneys in New York, the man who would later defend the Scottsboro Boys, received a phone call at his Manhattan office. The caller was anonymous. The message was simple. One of his potential clients was being mistreated at Sing Sing, and there might be a civil rights violation worth investigating. Leibovitz, who had political ambitions and an eye for cases that generated publicity, made a note to look into it. Second, 5 guards at Sing Sing each received envelopes at their home addresses. Inside was cash, the exact amount of their monthly gambling debts. No note, no explanation, just money and the implicit message that someone knew their vulnerabilities. Third, someone made a phone call to the office of New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt. The caller identified themselves as a concerned citizen and suggested that the governor might want to review the deplorable racial conditions at Sing Sing before they became a scandal during an election year. Roosevelt was preparing to run for president. The timing was perfect. None of these actions was illegal. None was overtly threatening. But together, they created what military strategists call cascading pressure. Multiple small forces that, when properly aligned, can collapse structures far larger than themselves. And Johnson sat in his cell, reading a book about Julius Caesar, waiting. Wednesday evening, April 13th, 7:30 p.m. Guard Patrick Sullivan was walking the D-block corridor during his regular rounds. The cells were locked. Inmates were supposed to be settling in for lights out, and everything appeared normal. Except it wasn't. Sullivan later told investigators, in a statement he gave before he resigned, that he heard someone call his name from one of the cells. Not yelling, not aggressive, just a calm voice saying Sullivan as he walked past. He stopped and looked. It was an inmate named Carlo Moretti, no relation to guard Vincent Moretti, a mid-level member of the Genovese family, serving time for extortion. Carlo was standing at his cell bars, not threatening, not even unfriendly. "You should know," Carlo said quietly, "that people are talking about what happened yesterday. The thing with Johnson. Word got out. People on the outside are asking questions." Sullivan told him to shut up and keep moving. But Carlo just smiled. "I'm not threatening you," he said. "I'm helping you. Because here's what you don't understand. When people on the outside start asking questions about guards who use certain language with inmates, sometimes journalists get interested. Sometimes lawyers get interested. And sometimes, when they dig into one guard's history, they find interesting things. Outstanding debts. Missing incident reports. That poker game last month that maybe got a little out of control." Sullivan's face went white. How did this inmate know about the poker game? "Just advice between friends," Carlo continued. "Maybe think about who you owe money to. Maybe think about whether you want certain stories being told. Sleep well, Sullivan." That conversation was reported to Deputy Warden Arthur Kinsey the next morning. Kinsey dismissed it as an empty threat. But Sullivan looked, according to other guards, like he hadn't slept at all. Meanwhile, guard Thomas McKinley was having his own problems. McKinley lived in a boarding house in Yonkers, about 6 miles from the prison. Wednesday night, he came home to find his landlady, Mrs. Agnes Brennan, waiting for him in the hallway with a concerned expression. "Someone came by for you today," she said. "Well-dressed gentleman. Said he was an old friend. Left you an envelope." Inside the envelope was a photograph, a picture of McKinley taken outside a speakeasy in Manhattan 3 weeks earlier. Nothing illegal about being in the photo. But the speakeasy was owned by the Luciano family, and McKinley was in the photo with 2 men who had organized crime connections. There was no note, no threat, just the photo and the message it implied. "We know where you go. We know who you associate with. We have evidence that could end your career or worse. McKinley didn't sleep that night either. By Thursday morning, April 14th, Warden Lewis Laws was facing a crisis he couldn't fully understand. Laws was, by all accounts, a good man in a brutal system. He'd written books advocating for prison reform. He believed in rehabilitation over punishment. He'd introduced educational programs at Sing Sing and tried to treat inmates with a measure of dignity that was rare in 1930s corrections. But he was also a political animal, and he understood when the ground was shifting beneath him. Thursday morning, 8 a.m., Laws received a phone call from the New York State Commissioner of Correction, informing him that Governor Roosevelt's office had received concerning reports about racial tensions at Sing Sing. An investigation might be forthcoming. At 9:30 a.m., Samuel Leibovitz's office sent a letter to the prison requesting permission to interview several inmates regarding potential civil rights violations. The letter specifically mentioned racially motivated mistreatment by correctional staff. At 10:15 a.m., guard Vincent Mority knocked on the warden's door and submitted his resignation, effective immediately. He gave no explanation. He just placed the paper on Law's desk and walked out. At 11 a.m., Deputy Warden Kinsey informed Laws that 3 more guards had called in sick that morning, including Thomas McKinley. Given the timing and the fact that these guards rarely called in sick, Kinsey suggested that something was wrong. And throughout all of this, Bumpy Johnson sat in the prison library, reading the newspaper, his expression as calm as still water. What Laws didn't know, what he couldn't know without investigating his own staff, was that the pressure was coming from every direction simultaneously. The lawyer's inquiry wasn't random. It had been triggered by outside interests. The governor's concern wasn't spontaneous. It had been planted by someone with access to political channels. The guards weren't just getting cold feet. They were being systematically isolated and frightened by a campaign of psychological pressure that left no fingerprints. This is what made Johnson dangerous. He didn't break the rules. He made other people worry that their own rule-breaking would be exposed. Before we continue with what happened in those final hours, I need to pause and acknowledge something. If you're still watching this, you're exactly the kind of person who appreciates real history told the right way. Stories like this take dozens of hours to research, verify, and script. If you want to see more deep dives into the hidden power structures of American crime history, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for yourself. Because this story gets even stranger from here. Thursday, 2 p.m. Warden Laws sat in his office with 3 documents in front of him. The first was a confidential memo from Harold Danforth, the state investigator who had begun asking quiet questions about guard conduct at Sing Sing. Danforth's preliminary findings suggested that multiple correctional officers may have financial relationships with outside entities that pose security risks. The second was a letter from the NAACP's New York chapter, which had somehow learned about the incident in the dining hall and was threatening to organize protests outside the prison if a formal investigation wasn't launched. The third was a resignation letter from Deputy Warden Kinsey, who simply wrote, "I can no longer effectively maintain discipline in this facility under current circumstances." Laws was a smart man. He understood that he was watching something unprecedented, a coordinated campaign to destabilize his command structure, orchestrated from inside a locked cell. But he also understood something else. Fighting this would mean exposing the corruption in his own guard force. It would mean admitting that Sing Sing's security had been compromised. It would mean congressional hearings, investigations, media scrutiny, and the destruction of his reputation as a reformer. Or he could step away, claim health reasons, take a position in private sector prison consulting that he'd been offered 6 months earlier. Let someone else clean up this mess. At 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, April 14th, 1932, Warden Lewis Laws called the Commissioner of Correction and tendered his resignation, effective in 30 days. The official reason given to the press: personal health concerns and a desire to pursue writing full-time. The real reason: A man in a cell had demonstrated that power doesn't flow from the top down in a prison system as neatly as the organizational chart suggests. And Laws wasn't willing to be the warden who presided over the exposure of just how compromised that system really was. Within a week, Thomas McKinley, Patrick Sullivan, and Vincent Moretti had all left Sing Sing. McKinley transferred to a low-security facility upstate. Sullivan quit corrections entirely and moved to Pennsylvania. Moretti simply disappeared from state employment records. None was formally disciplined. None was charged with misconduct. They simply left. And Bumpy Johnson served out the remainder of his sentence without further incident, was released in 1934, and returned to Harlem, where his legend had grown considerably during his time away. The Sing Sing incident became part of Johnson's mythology, though the full details remained hidden for decades. Most people who heard the story assumed violence was involved, that Johnson had ordered hits or orchestrated a prison riot. The truth was more subtle and, in its way, more frightening. Johnson had demonstrated something that would define his career for the next 30 years. The most effective power is the kind that doesn't announce itself. It's the lawyer who just happens to call at the right moment. The envelope that arrives with no return address. The investigation that begins because someone made a single phone call to the right office. Stephanie St. Clair later told an interviewer, years after Johnson's death, that the Sing Sing situation was a masterclass in leverage. She said Johnson understood something that most criminals didn't. You don't fight power with violence. You fight it with information, timing, and by making powerful people more afraid of you than of breaking their own rules. The incident also revealed the deep structural problems in America's prison system during the Depression. When guards were underpaid and inmates had connections to operations making real money, the official hierarchy was always vulnerable to subversion. Sing Sing wasn't unique. Similar dynamics existed in dozens of prisons nationwide. Johnson just understood how to exploit them better than most. After his release in 1934, Johnson became one of the most influential figures in Harlem's criminal underworld for the next 3 decades. He worked with the Italian mob, maintained his own power base in Black Harlem, and became known for something unusual in the violent world of organized crime, almost never resorting to violence first. His preferred methods were always the same ones he'd used in Sing Sing: pressure, leverage, information, and patience. He understood that reputation could be a weapon more effective than any gun, and that making an example of someone didn't require killing them. Sometimes it just required demonstrating that you could destroy their career, their security, or their peace of mind without ever laying a hand on them. Malcolm X, who met Johnson in Harlem in the 1940s, later described him as the smartest criminal I ever knew, not because of his violence, but because of his strategic thinking. Bumpy could see the whole chessboard, Malcolm said in a 1963 interview. He knew which pieces moved which ways, and he was always thinking 5 moves ahead. The 3 guards who insulted him learned that lesson the hard way. They thought they had power because they wore uniforms and carried keys. Johnson taught them that power is more complicated than that an inmate who understands leverage can dismantle your life without breaking a single rule. As for Warden Laws, he went on to have a successful career as a writer and prison reform advocate. He never publicly discussed the circumstances of his resignation, but his books written after leaving Sing Sing contain several passages about the unseen power structures in prisons and the naive belief that walls and bars create absolute control. Those who knew the real story understood what he was talking about. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, of congestive heart failure. He was 62 years old. His funeral in Harlem drew thousands of mourners, legitimate community members, politicians, and criminals alike. The Sing Sing incident was mentioned in several eulogies, always in vague terms, always with the knowing smiles of people who understood what really happened but knew better than to say it plainly. The story itself has been told and retold over the decades, usually exaggerated into something more violent, more dramatic, more Hollywood. The truth that Johnson dismantled an entire prison command structure through careful cultivation of relationships, strategic application of pressure, and an almost supernatural understanding of institutional vulnerability is less cinematic but more impressive. It's also more instructive. The Sing Sing incident wasn't about a gangster getting revenge. It was about a man demonstrating that the institutions we think of as solid and impenetrable, prisons, government agencies, legal structures, are actually held together by human beings with human weaknesses. And human beings can be influenced, pressured, frightened, or compromised if you understand their vulnerabilities and have the patience to exploit them. This is why Johnson remained powerful for so many years in a world where violent men came and went like seasonal weather. Violence is easy. Violence is obvious. Violence attracts attention and creates enemies. What Johnson practiced was something different. A kind of social chess where the goal was never to capture the king through direct assault, but to control the board so completely that the king had no moves left. 3 guards insulted him on a Tuesday morning in April 1932. 48 hours later, the warden quit. No violence, no riot, no broken rules, just power applied with precision by a man who understood that the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a knife. It's knowledge, timing, and the ability to make powerful people realize they're not as powerful as they think. That's the real story of what happened at Sing Sing. That's why, nearly a century later, people still talk about the morning 3 guards made a mistake they'd spend the rest of their lives regretting. And that's why Bumpy Johnson's name is still spoken with a mixture of fear and respect in certain circles. Not because of what he did, but because of what he understood about how power really works. The walls of Sing Sing are still standing on the banks of the Hudson River. The dining hall where this story began still serves breakfast to inmates. But the lesson Johnson taught there, that April morning, remains relevant. Never confuse authority with power. They're not always the same thing. And sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one sitting quietly, eating his oatmeal, thinking 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still celebrating their first move.